Hi guys, Miss Francis here. The last video you watched was all about defining a species, but sometimes that definition of species has limitations. For example, when it comes to extinct organisms, we really don't know for sure which extinct organisms mated with other organisms. So how can we 100% state that extinct organisms are members of X species or Y species? We lack the information on interbreeding. Another example is species that reproduce entirely asexually. Again, we lack information on interbreeding. They don't mate with anybody else. They mate with themselves. So in this case, we assign these types of species based mainly on their structural and biochemical characteristics. But what we do know is that there are two modes of speciation: allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. So in general, allopatric speciation is when geographic separation of population restricts the gene flow, thus a new species will evolve. In sympatric speciation, populations aren't separated geographically, but there are reproductive isolating mechanisms that prevent them from interbreeding. So let's take a look at allopatric speciation in greater detail. But first, check out this image. So do you guys see how in allopatric speciation, there is this geographic barrier, a river which cut through that rock, creating two sides, where now I've got a species of trees that originally started out as one species has now become two species. An example would be the Grand Canyon. But in sympatric speciation, do you see how I have this species that has appeared kind of in the middle of the parent population? That's an example of sympatric speciation. And that occurs when there is a change in chromosome number. But let's take a detailed look at allopatric speciation, and then we'll take a detailed look at sympatric speciation. So allopatric speciation is all about geological features or processes that can fragment a population into two or more isolated populations. Islands are an excellent place to study evolution because islands are physically separated. Therefore, they have their own environments, and then each island is isolated and will have endemic species because those species have to adapt to that particular environment. Other examples of geological features that might cause allopatric speciation are mountain ranges, glaciers, land bridges, even humans building roads or building a mall. That is a geological feature that can lead to allopatric speciation. The Grand Canyon, like we said, it's an impassable barrier, and what ended up happening is that you've got two different species of squirrels on either side. The likelihood of allopatric speciation increases when a population is both small and isolated. So like we mentioned with the islands are often isolated, so it's more likely that you're going to see allopatric speciation. Furthermore, if there is a small population, you're also more likely to see allopatric speciation. So Darwin's Galapagos Islands were an excellent example of a small isolated population where he was able to see allopatric speciation in action. Now, how do we definitely know that allopatric speciation has occurred? Well, it is determined by whether or not the separated populations can come back together, can interbreed, and produce fertile offspring. If they cannot come back together, interbreed, and produce fertile offspring, then allopatric speciation has occurred. You guys have seen this vocabulary word already, adaptive radiation. We saw it when we were talking about Darwin and again his studies of the Galapagos Islands. It is the evolution of many diversely adapted species from a common ancestor. So do you see how all of these species actually evolved from this common ancestor of A, that's known as adaptive radiation. Okay, so let's take a greater look at sympatric speciation. So sympatric speciation occurs when a new species seems to arise within the range of the parent population, and it's usually due to something called a mutant condition, which is known as polyploidy, where the organism has an extra set of chromosomes. So now this organism is known as a tetraploid. It's got double the number of chromosomes, which is probably because of non-disjunction during meiosis. So now my tetraploid organisms can no longer mate with the diploids from the original population. This occurs in plants. It's rare, but you will see it in plants. For example, oats, cotton, potatoes, tobacco, wheat are examples of polyploid organisms. And actually, plant geneticists are now hybridizing plants and using chemicals to actually induce meiotic and mitotic errors to create polyploids with special qualities. For example, hybrids that have the combined benefits of producing a high yield with the ability to resist disease. This should also be a familiar picture. This was Darwin's model of the time frame of evolution. Darwin believed in gradualism. Gradual divergence from a common ancestor over long spans of time was how evolution occurred. More recently, a Harvard professor, Mr. Gould, proposed the idea of punctuated equilibrium, where evolution occurs when species remain the same for long periods, but there's some sort of event and equilibrium is interrupted, which then results in rapid bursts of change, which leads to new species. In our next video, we'll be discussing the heterotroph hypothesis.